Namaskar, Namaste everyone. On behalf of Central Secretariat Library with City Book Leaders, I welcome you all for this session with Professor Mira on the life of C. Subramania Bharati, based upon her book, The Coming Age, the one that you can see in my background. My name is Mohit Gupta, and I will be the session host for this nearly 30 to 35 minutes of conversation with Professor Mira Rajan. To begin with the session, I would like to quote that I came across Subramania Bharati at a time when Bharati left the world at similar to that age. While I am almost 40, that was a time when Subramania Bharati left this world in 1921. And I felt so ignorant that I had no idea who this Mahakavi Subramania Bharati is. It's only because of a project that I was working with IGNCA, and it was my job to read and study and figure out such legendary freedom fighters and the contributors to our country's independence that I came across C. Subramania Bharati. And I'm blessed that in the last couple of months, I've been able to go through nothing less than 10 to 12 books around Subramania Bharati. One definitely is by Dr. Vijay Bharati, Professor Mira's mother. It's a remarkable book, and the best is when I received it, it's a typical classic with hard cover and it's a paper bound. It's a beautiful book, and I would like to show my notes that I actually made around this book. It's a remarkable book which takes you into a lovely journey of C. Subramania Bharati's life, and it also brings in a lot of aspects that are interconnected, intersewn into his life that has made him to be a true Mahatma. Many times we know that Mahatma is associated with Mahatma Gandhi. And of course, to everyone with whom we speak about, whose ideologies, whose philosophies we always follow in life. And I believe that's what Bharati has accomplished after almost exactly 100 years while he left us. His inspiration, his writings are still, I must say, they are very much in fashion and in vogue when it comes to inspiring others and masses. And that's what Subramania Bharati's contribution is. I would like to formally introduce to you C. Subramania Bharati, who lived 1882 to 1921, was one of the builders of modern India, an early nationalist thinker from South India. Bharati's literary genius ignited a renaissance in the literature of his native language, that is Tamil. He is known as the Mahakavi, which is the supreme poet of the Tamils. And many times, quote unquote, we also call him Tamil Tagore, which I think is up to an extent is a comparison which is not required somehow. It's possibly our own ignorance, and especially people like me who have been always in North India, who never realized that there is so much treasure in our country that we as countrymen should explore, even if we are in the country or outside the country. He is known to be as a Mahakavi of the Tamils. Bharati can lay the claim to be one of the India's foremost egalitarian writers, arguing for the supremacy of women and the irrelevance of caste. If I have to compare with him, possibly from slightly or with any other poet, I think it would be Nazir, who has actually written poem about everything, and that's what Subramania Bharati has also written poem about Jesus, on Allah, on Russia. He has picked up so many subjects that it's amazing to see how a person at that young and ripe age could even pursue such interests. And that's what Subramania Bharati is to us. The popularity of his songs during the freedom movement, long after his death, led to the government of India giving the copyrights of his works to the people of India as a gift. And altogether, now there are episodes, there are books around the claim of the copyright as well, which itself has been a subject of a biopic possibly. On behalf of Central Secretariat Library, in collaboration with CBL, we are celebrating the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, which is the 75th year. We're hosting Professor Mira Rajan, a noted author and a great-granddaughter of Bharati, who shall share her thoughts from her latest book, C. Subramania Bharati, The Coming Age, which is a collection of Bharati's writings. That's what she has edited. Formally introducing all of you to Mira, Professor Mira. Professor Mira T. Sundarajan is a writer, a classic pianist, and a scholar and professor who holds a doctorate in law from Oxford University. A Canadian citizen by birth, she is fluent in English and French and has read both literatures extensively. She's the daughter of Bharati scholar S. Vijay Bharati, I just mentioned to you, and a great-granddaughter of Mahakavi Bharati. This session is a tribute to the great poet and the patriot on his 100th death anniversary, who breathed his last on 11th September 1921 at a ripe age of 39. And I must say he lived the life to the fullest that we are remembering him today. And we have so much inspiration to be taken from his life. I now invite Professor Mira Sundara to present her thoughts and also to introduce us to the life of Bharati.
Thank you so much for those kind words and indeed for your invitation today. I'm absolutely delighted that I could join you for this session, and nothing could make me happier than to have the opportunity to speak to all of you about one of my absolute favorite subjects in the world, my great-grandfather, C. Subramania Bharati, and of course this new book that has just been published of Bharati's writings. And Sri Mohit speaks so well that, generally speaking, it's impossible to disagree with him on anything. I only have one point of disagreement in everything that you said, which is you said Bharati left us 100 years ago. So I would respectfully beg to differ and say, no, he's very much present today in many senses, but definitely in the sense that his writings are present with us. They are alive and well. His thoughts and ideas continue to be with us and continue to be an inspiration, I think, for anyone who has the good fortune to be able to read them. Lovely. So the title of my short presentation today is Mahakavi C. Subramania Bharati, a National Bard. And as Sri Mohit mentioned, a very important anniversary is coming up in just a few days, September 11th, 2021. It will be exactly 100 years to the day that Bharatiyar passed to the other world. And I consider that to be the moment at which his legacy was born. It's a great privilege and also something quite humbling for me that over the past year, and indeed going back even further, the book for which you're seeing the cover now has been more than a decade in the making, actually. But the past year has been a time of intensive work on it. And I'm very, very privileged and humbled to be able to offer this publication to celebrate the 100 years of Bharatiyar's legacy. And it's Penguin Modern Classics that has brought the book out. It is the book of Bharati's original writings in the English language. And Penguin Modern Classics has just done a superlative job with this project. Without their vision, the book simply could not have been published like this or in time for the anniversary. So many, many thanks are due to them. And I'm quite excited to see that beside Mohit ji, there is a book, because I have not yet seen the physical book, which is apparently in transit somewhere between India and California. So I'm very happy to see the book there on your desk and know that it is available in India. Very, very good. So when Mohit had invited me to have this presentation today, he had proposed a title for the presentation, A National Bard. And I was intrigued by this. And when I went away and thought about it a little bit, I thought this is an absolutely ingenious title. It's a wonderful title to talk about Subramania Bharati. Why? Well, there are two main reasons that struck me right away. First of all, those who speak Tamil call Bharati a Mahakavi. In English, when we speak about the bard, we talk about Shakespeare. And I think that a very nice comparison can be made between Bharati, the Tamil Mahakavi, as the Shakespeare of the Tamils, and of course, the Shakespeare of the English. Why do I say that? Because Bharati's writing accomplished two things that are very similar to what Shakespeare's writing has achieved for the English, much earlier in time, of course. First of all, his writing inspired other writers and helped to create a renaissance in 20th century Tamil literature. And secondly, Bharati's Tamil is of such quality that in a sense he has recreated the Tamil language for modern speech in a very beautiful way. And so when we speak Tamil today, much of what we use in the language is actually derived from Bharati's writing. So it's a tremendous contribution at the level of the language. And so I would say in this sense, he's very much a bard. He is a kind of Shakespeare of the Tamils, given what he has accomplished for the Tamil language and culture. Secondly, this idea of his being a national bard, I think it's so fitting because Bharati was a nationalist, a freedom fighter, but his nationalism was of a particular kind. It was a pan-Indian nationalism. And in fact, it's well worth remembering that India is such a vast place. And during the national struggle, people made enormous contributions and enormous sacrifices from every corner of this vast, great land. Every culture, every group you can imagine, there was somebody who stepped forward and had the heroism to stand up for Indian nationalism and to resist the British rule. So this is very much the pan-Indian nationalism of which Bharati was a part and was a leader. And moreover, in his own training, he had the opportunity to live in different parts of India and to absorb the ethos that he experienced in different parts of the country. So in that sense, in his person, he incarnates a pan-Indian ideal. So in the light of those considerations, it seems only appropriate to begin considering Bharati's story with a map of India. And if we want to see where Bharati's point of origin was, we have to look in the far south of the country, the far southeast. We can see Tamil Nadu state. Now, if we take a closer look at Tamil Nadu, you see a number of districts here. We have to keep looking towards the south. So if we go deep into the south, we can see Tirunelveli district and Thoothukudi district. And these two districts are the area where Bharati traces his origin. In fact, he came from the town of Ettayapuram, and his wife came from the Tirunelveli district from the village of Kadayam. So let's take a still closer look. And just here we can see towards the top of this map, the town of Ettayapuram, which was Bharati's place of birth. And in fact, this is the house where Subramania Bharati was born in Ettayapuram. It's now a museum. And the interesting thing about Ettayapuram is it was a town that had a Maharaja in those days. And Bharati grew up in the environment of the Maharaja's court, the Samasthanam of the Maharaja. His father was one of the people associated with the court and used to take Bharati as a small boy to the court. And there was a group of people there who were Tamil scholars and Tamil writers who got to know the little boy. The little boy was very precocious. And in fact, he impressed the community of scholars so much with his poetical skills while he was just a child, truly a prodigy, that they gave him the name Bharati when he was 7 years old. So he had already showed his excellence in poetry at the age of 7, and this was recognized by the scholars of the court. So Bharati is not Subramania Bharati's given name. That is a title that was acquired by him as a 7-year-old boy, given to him by the scholars of the court of the Maharaja of Ettayapuram. And here's a picture of the Maharaja, just to help to bring that period to life. So after Bharati's father passed away, he was a teenager, feeling quite aimless in his life in many ways. And he had a wonderful opportunity at that time to go and stay with some relatives in Varanasi, where he pursued his studies. And when he got there, he was absolutely intoxicated with the atmosphere of the city, the deep learning of the traditional culture, the languages, the study of Sanskrit and Hindi. He embraced all of that with typical, characteristic youthful enthusiasm, which never left him, by the way. And he became so absorbed into the life there that he also adopted at that time his manner of dress. So this is when he started wearing the turban and the jacket and presenting himself essentially in North Indian style, I would venture to say. And that is the image of Subramania Bharati that has become iconic. So when Bharati became involved in the national movement, he began traveling to the various Congress meetings and participating in the various national activities. When he went to the meeting in Surat, he then came back towards the south of India, and at that time he had the chance to meet another important figure in the national movement, Sister Nivedita. Sister Nivedita, as many of you will know, was an Irish woman who became a great devotee and disciple of Swami Vivekananda. And in fact, her main role when she came to India was to lead initiatives related to women's education, about which she was very, very passionate. And indeed, Swami Vivekananda himself, of course, was very passionate. And Swami Vivekananda says about her, what was wanted was not a man, but a woman, a real lioness to work for the Indians, women especially. So when Bharati was traveling on his way between the Surat Congress and the South, he met Sister Nivedita and actually had a vision of what the place of women should be in society that inspired him very deeply. And then he went on to dedicate the first volume of his national songs to Sister Nivedita, saying that she was his guru and that from her he had learned the meaning of service to the nation. Quite a remarkable fate for an Irish woman to find in India as well. And here then is a picture of Bharati as he matured with his wife Chellamma. And to me, this is a tremendously moving picture because my understanding is that in those days, husband and wife didn't usually take pictures like this. A typical picture would involve the men of the family seated, the women standing behind them. Bharati said, no, my wife is my life partner. She is my equal. She is my companion in the national struggle. She is standing beside me, and she and I are a unit. And that is how we're going to be photographed together. So he not only espoused the values of feminism, but he lived those values in his everyday life as well. Eventually, his activities against the British, in particular his writing in favor of the freedom movement, became very troublesome to the administration in Madras province, and his writings ended up being proscribed. And a great deal of pressure built about his presence in South India until finally he decided that he had to leave British territory. And so he fled with his family to Pondicherry, where he joined the community of exiles, nationalist exiles, who had left British India and went to live under the French administration, as it then was in Pondicherry. And this is a picture of the house where he lived there, which has now been made a museum as well. And a great deal of renovation has been done to this house. This is actually not how it looked the last time that I visited it, but there is a wonderful collection there of many materials about Bharati, his life and writings. In fact, he spent 11 years in Pondicherry, and during that time he wrote many of his literary masterpieces, many of his major poems, as well as remaining involved to the greatest extent that he could in journalistic writing and in pro-nationalist writing in various newspapers and so on. And one of the things that he describes in the book that has just been published is actually what it was like to live in that situation. So how the nationalist exiles were treated in Pondicherry, how their presence was tolerated by the French administration, but there was some understanding between the French and the British all the same. And these people who were fighting for India had to endure quite a bit of harassment by the British police. They would make forays into Pondicherry, try to capture these people and take them back to face courts and jail and various punishments under the British administration. So it was a very tense situation, and Bharati and his family were living like the other exiles, very much on the edge, although they had fled to the French territory of Pondicherry. This then is a photograph of Bharati's family as it became more extended, and as well as his disciples, the two young men standing in the back. So we see Bharati, we see Chellamma, his wife, who is seated beside him. And then on the side of the screen, two young women that you see there, the young woman and the young girl, are Bharati's daughters. So the lady who is standing, Thangamar Bharati, was his elder daughter. She was my grandmother. And then the young girl who is seated, Shakuntala Bharati, she is the younger daughter of Bharati. And I wanted to show you this photograph, which was taken not very long before Bharati's death, because when he passed away, his legacy was left in the hands of these three women, two young women and a young girl. And they have done an enormous amount, especially Chellama, and her legacy was then carried on by Thangama and to an extent Shakuntala. They have done an enormous amount to preserve Bharati's works and to facilitate their dissemination in the period following his death. Their contribution really is immeasurable, particularly the contribution of Chellama, and that deserves to be recognized. I can say one more interesting thing there, because we're talking about the biography of Bharatiya right now. Chellama Bharati actually became his first biographer. So she wrote a book called Bharatiya Charitra. Now, in those days, women typically did not get a very high level of education. And sure enough, Chellama's ability to read and write was limited. Almost all the education she received was from her husband, through the study of her husband's poetry. And in fact, she had such a remarkable mind and devotion to that poetry that she more or less memorized everything that he had written. And ultimately, when she wanted to write about her husband's life, she dictated his biography to Thangamar, who actually was the scribe for that book. And thereby she became the first biographer of her husband. Here is a slightly longer term picture. So in this photograph, we see both Bharati's children and his grandchildren. So in the middle, that is Chellama, who then became a widow in those days when Bharati passed away, and did not on that account acquire any discouragement or lose any confidence in her devotion to the mission of promoting Bharati's works, disseminating Bharati's works that carried her throughout her life. And on this, I think it would be the screen left then, you can see Thangamar Bharati, the elder daughter, and then Thangamar's daughter, Lalita, is there. On the screen right, Shakuntala, the younger daughter of Bharati, and one more granddaughter there. And then sitting in front, the children, the young girl on the far right of the screen is actually Vijaya Bharati, my mother, and the author of the book that Sri Mohit described so beautifully. And in fact, Vijaya Bharati's contribution is worth an extra mention because she grew up to become the first person to undertake a critical study of Bharati's works. So she was the first scholar to study his works formally in an academic setting. And she did that at Annamalai University in Chidambaram. And that book that Mohit was actually telling you about is a slightly reworked English translation of her thesis, her PhD thesis on Bharatiya, which inaugurated the field of Bharati criticism. So today we are in a fortunate position to be celebrating the 100th anniversary of Bharatiya's legacy. What exactly does that legacy involve? Well, I think some of the key elements are listed here. The idea of national dignity, of course, is key. And there he was speaking about the dignity of India, which must be recognized as against the British rulers of the time. But he also had a much broader vision in that regard. He said all nations must appear as equals on the world stage. People of all nations must respect each other as equals, including Indians. So that was a very strong notion of national dignity and cultural dignity that he had. Women's rights, very much the center of his legacy, as I illustrated in those photographs that I was able to show you. He was a great champion and pioneer of women's rights. And I think that to this day, not only would we be able to say that he is one of the leading Indians who championed women's rights, but that around the world, he must be one of the leading thinkers on women's social role. And he was such a visionary, he saw so far ahead in time that we as a society have certainly moved towards Bharatiya's ideals of women's equality, but we still have a long way to go to achieve the society that Bharatiya had in mind. Similarly, with caste equality, Bharati's pioneering work there must be recognized. He was standing right beside Mahatma Gandhi in terms of his incredibly deep commitment to caste equality. And many stories can be told to illustrate that, as well as looking in his works, in his written works, of course. And again, it was not only caste equality at the Indian level, but equality in every sense around the world, between races, genders, ages. There should be no reason for having any discrimination against any human being, any human individual. And he stood absolutely firmly by that principle and lived by it. In fact, I think this expression, which is ubiquitous in many ways, unity in diversity, should be invoked in describing Bharati, because it is such a perfect description of how he saw the world and how he saw reality. And I think in that sense, he was deeply influenced by Advaita philosophy, and himself was a great modern exponent of Advaita, which of course teaches the unity of all creation. And that was the foundational belief driving everything that Bharati thought and wrote, and carrying him throughout his life, from which he never deviated. So in terms of the Indian struggle, I'm just quoting from one of his poems here. He said, "Yellarum yennattu makkal." Everyone, all Indians are my people. They are the people of my country. Yellarum yennattu makkal. What is exciting about the book that has just been published is that we see Bharati's writing in the English language, and at the same time, his interests are so diverse and his writing was so active. He was so readily engaged in writing in English as well as in Tamil, that his personality emerges through these English writings just as much as we might see it, just as truly as we might see it by reading his Tamil writings. There's no doubt about it. The Bharati that we see then is a pan-Indian figure. He is a multilingual person and a lover of languages and of poetry. One of his pen names was actually Shelleydasan, in homage to the great English romantic poet Shelley. He admired the West Wind ode to the West Wind of Shelley. He was a multifaceted personality, as I've tried to highlight here, involved in all of these different aspects of Indian life and society, and indeed in life, society, and events all around the world. He was a universalist, again, seeing himself as an Indian on the world stage. One of the essays in the book is actually called India and the World. So he felt that he was representing Indian culture, and that Indian culture was one of the great gems of human civilization that must meet all other cultures on terms of equality and indeed on terms of generosity. He said India has a lot to give to the world. Indian culture has untold riches to share with the world, and the world must receive that gift. And then, as I mentioned, he was fascinated by Advaita, and I called him a modern exponent of Advaita. That passion also runs very deep, because he was engaged in promoting the national struggle and in helping to build modern India. But he was also engaged in building himself as a man of the future. So in a sense, this project of construction, of creation, of building affected everything that he looked at. It was at the individual level, it was at the social level, and it was the national level and international level. Freedom and positive energy must occur at all of these levels for human society to be fully evolved and for human beings to be fully developed and to have opportunities to develop fully. So I'll just conclude with one further remark, actually going back to something interesting that Sri Mohit said at the beginning. You spoke about Bharati as possibly the Tagore of the Tamils. And actually, I like this expression very much. One reason being that Bharati himself admired Tagore so much. And one of the pieces that is in this book is actually a piece of journalism that Bharatiya wrote upon Tagore's travel to Japan. So one of the dreams that Bharatiya had was that he would be able to travel around the world. He wanted to see other countries and cultures, speak to people. And unfortunately, that dream never became a reality. For example, in my case, I have traveled all over the world, including to Japan. And I often think to myself that it's because of my great-grandfather's blessings that I could travel like that, because he had that dream. So we, his descendants, at least, are able to realize that. But he writes about Tagore's travel to Japan, and he says, he was astonished by all the honors that were shown to Tagore. And he says, this is a tremendous thing for India, because Tagore has gone there representing us, representing our country and culture. And look how the Japanese are recognizing us and meeting us on terms of respect and, in fact, homage. So it's absolutely appropriate, as Mohitji suggested, to refer to Bharati as the Tagore of the Tamils, and I think he would be very proud to be referred to as such, and his contributions are very comparable in many ways. In fact, frankly, I think all of the great poets of the world, when we talk about poets of such stature, they belong to a family in themselves as well. So we are his family in one sense. The community of poets of the world, they are a family in another sense. So thank you very much for bringing up that comparison. And I hope that my comments here have given you some idea, among other things, of the contents of the book and of the wonderful personality and insights of the poet that may be found therein. This opportunity to know him occurs through the English language. So everyone who speaks English now can read Bharati. And by doing so, there's a tremendous enrichment to be gained, because Bharati was such a true exponent of Indian culture and such a deep student of Indian culture through many of her linguistic and cultural traditions. So I would urge everyone to read Bharati, know India and her culture through Bharati, and know poetry, know life. Bharatiyar said, "He whose poetry is his life and whose life is his poetry, that person is a true poet." Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Wow. I must say this is one of the most profound presentations on Bharati. And I think you're truly blessed, Professor Mira. And it seems he has himself endowed you as well as your mother with all these expressions, not only in terms of your literary adventures, but also I know that you also pursue music to a great extent. And it would be an important mention to tell you that today we have few people from Tamil Sangam, from Delhi Tamil Sangam. We have Dr. Srinivas, who's coming from Madurai, a very renowned scholar. We have Lakshmi Ayarji. We have Hamsini Murthy, who's somehow related to Bharati. And in fact, she introduced me to one of the close relatives in India as well. And what you have just said about Bharati takes us into a deeper thinking, and we should now actually ponder more about the legendary work that he has done. And it's a responsibility of, as part of our culture, that how those thoughts reshaped India during those times, especially while he was in Pondicherry and he got inspired by Sri Aurobindo. In fact, everyone he met during the same time while Tagore was in Chennai, that was the same time he was also there doing the same work. It's just that they couldn't meet, and the exchange of the ideas could not happen. Certainly, he met Mahatma Gandhi ji, and he has been influenced by everything good that was there in others, and that's what happens when someone. And I think your mother has written in the book that when ego is gone, the prose becomes poetry, and I think that's what Subramania Bharati represents in our lives. And many times the pursuit of poetry as a genre, I think it's a very important thing to do. I have some quick questions, and before we take questions from our esteemed audience as well, my first question to you would be, while we are talking about him after 100 years, he's still here, and as I mentioned, Mahatma. What do you think is what are those uniqueness or unique views that are still relevant today? Of course, you mentioned about women equality, secularism, the way he spoke. So either we have not changed, or is it the power of vision that he observed in the forthcoming? And that too, it's so relevant even today, even after 75 years of our independence. What's your view on that, Professor Bharati?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think it is his power of vision. And this to me is what sets apart a poet and a visionary poet of this kind, because he looks forward in time in a way that is unusual. And he's able to visualize things that seem impossible to those who are alive in the present day. Even something as simple as the freedom from British rule. Well, it's simple now in hindsight, but to take ourselves back to what the situation was more than 100 years ago, the British Empire was the most powerful entity that had ever existed in the world, in human history. And yet for him, It was a matter of course that they would be gone from India and that India would get self-rule. And it was at the peak of the empire while he was writing that. And I think it's actually quite mistaken to say that, well, these were imaginative people and they tried to see, they tried to see forward, they tried to be optimistic. I think it's actually something much deeper than that, that they had visionary experiences that actually helped them to visualize these things happening. So I think with that kind of vision about everything that he touched, really, his writing continues to be relevant. I mean, I can't even express how relevant it is. If you pick up that book and flip to anything there, you may as well think that it was written today or yesterday or maybe tomorrow. Which is not to say, I think we have changed as a society, but we have not gone the full distance of what he envisioned, because his characteristic was clarity of mind, arivile telivu, and he saw propositions through to their logical endpoints. So equality of women didn't mean that women could work, but then they would come home and cook and they would be in charge of cleaning up the house and so on. No, equality of women meant the whole way. Men and women, they share everything equally. So this was typical of his thinking. He had that kind of clarity and that kind of commitment to logic, if I can even put it that way, in his thinking. So we as a society have definitely progressed. And part of the reason we've progressed is because we have the great light provided by writing like this to help us to progress. But we still have a long way to go before we actually catch up to what he wrote about 100 years ago. So we need to keep moving forward.
Actually, that's a very fantastic way of looking at it. And I must admit, I'll be slightly selfish here when I will represent Mr. Rao from Central Secretariat Library, Rakesh ji, Vish ji, and all my colleagues from Central Secretariat Library. That possibly because he started reading at a very early age. He was always very fond of reading. And I think that's what gives you a complete 360-degree view. And a book actually makes you travel the whole world, I guess. And Bharati was fortunate enough to delve into the habit of reading. And I can say it because we represent a very reading-focused organization. So that could be one of the views. There's a very interesting aspect that has just come as a question, or I must say as an observation from Amudhanji. I don't know from where has he or she has logged in, but that's about the translation bit of it. While he's saying that on Tagore's Gitanjali, Keats, and there's a lot of great translation has been done. It's his personal view, while I may disagree to his view that the other translation that has been done on Bharati's works are slightly lacking in terms of the actual flow of the poet's views. But I think we still, as it's always said, the translation actually somewhere it doesn't give you that opportunity to bring that same flow that the poet really wanted to do. I guess that's one observation that has just come in, but he's still asking, is there a possibility that we see that great translation coming in? This is typically absolutely personal. Believe me, I'm just passing on the comments to you. But I still see there is equal opportunity and there's more to come for that aspect.
Yeah, if I may add a couple of comments there, I think that's actually an incredibly important question that's come in.
Yeah.
And, the situation with Bharati translation is actually, frankly, quite dreadful. Not only are there not adequate translations, but there are many translations that are circulating which totally misrepresent the works of the poet and the quality and so on. So the lack of translation is undoubtedly a problem. The lack of quality translation is undoubtedly a problem. How far can translation go in bringing the quality of the original language? That's just a question to which no one knows the answer. But what I can say for sure is I don't think the attempt to do the best possible translation has yet happened. And within this particular book, so let me just be absolutely clear that the book that has just been published is Bharati's original writing in English. So generally speaking, they're not translations, they're works that he wrote in English to begin with. But there are a few translations that he has made of his own poems and also of some classics from Tamil literature, from Nachiyar and so on. If you read those translations from the Tamil classics, tears will be coming down your face. He has done such beautiful translations from classical Tamil into English. And so I'm very hesitant to say you cannot do moving and important translations, because he has done some himself. So I think this is just a field where a certain momentum has to build up, and maybe the dialogue between the cultures, English and Tamil and Indian culture needs to be more prolonged in the future so that they can come to understand each other better and find some common ground. And that ultimately is what is going to build a better quality of translation. And let me make a final comment also that I think as well that by reading translation, hopefully those who read the translations will get inspired to go and look at the original Tamil. To my mind, the best translations are the ones where you have the original language on one page and then the translation on the other. And so you can actually have the two texts living before you and experience them both. I have used books like that myself in my study of language. And so I would like to think that that is the future. So Tamil should be reinvigorated through the act of translation and should gain a broader community in the future. Mahakavi Bharati loved the Tamil language, and I think that he would like to be part of the process of that happening for sure.
And I must vouch for it, Professor Mira. We have been studying Sanskrit for some time now. We have a very noted Acharya, which is more a Sanskrit appreciation that we do. So much so that after getting introduced to Bharati's work, my appreciation for the language has actually gone up. And I, being a chaste North Indian, I would love to delve into this language, not only Tamil, but other languages as well. And I think as part of our growing up, this learning should not go out as the countryman. And I'm taking the liberty on behalf of all the people who have come from Ministry of Culture. I think that's their impeccable job that they are doing for this country, especially the Central Secretariat Library, which being a hub of the collection of all the great books as well as articles. And I think they can play a great role on this. I'm very intrigued to know about Tamil for sure.
So yeah, that's wonderful too. That's wonderful to hear. Sorry, I was just going to add one more comment, because I don't think that Indians should at all blame themselves or blame ourselves in any way for not taking an interest or not being able to learn regional languages, because I think, frankly, that the British had a very active policy of trying to damp down those languages. And it's something that Bharati talks about in such an eye-opening way in a couple of very short, very pithy and powerful pieces. Those are gems that you can understand so much through reading those couple of pieces in the book.
In fact, the letter he wrote to the letter that you have included in this, it's a very powerful letter.
Absolutely. And so, what he's discussing there is the policy of the British to replace regional languages by English, but then not only the fact of replacing, but the spirit in which it was done. They called Tamil a vernacular language. And Bharati hated that term so much that he can't even write the word. He has to put it in quotations every time that he uses it. And finally he says, well, why is the vernacular Tamil anything less than the vernaculars of your countries, English and German? Our language is more ancient. We have works of a certain stature. Show me those comparable works in English and German in your languages, and tell me how they are better than ours before you call our language a vernacular. So it is about the closest. Bharati is never, ever a chauvinist. He's simply incapable of that perspective. It would be contemptible to him. That is the closest that he ever comes, though. Where he stands up for the language and says, I refuse to consider the Tamil language a vernacular, and the Europeans should not be referring to it as such.
True. I think I'll just I'll go slightly deeper into the philosophy of the work that C. Subramania Bharati has done. What do you think are the best forms of philosophy and spiritual practice, especially the one which is Uchi Medu Vani Dishindu, no fear, no fear, no fear, that poem. In fact, I keep reading to the translation of that poem, but I'm trying to recite in Tamil as well. I'll try my level best though. But what about that philosophical aspect towards looking everything at life in a very unique way?
Absolutely. So the poem, I think, is Achamillai, Achamillai, Achamenbadillai. So Acham is fear, Illai, there is no. So there is no fear, there's no fear, there's no such thing as fear. Fear itself doesn't exist. And absolutely, again, this is a wonderful question to ask. As I was describing a few moments ago, one of the interesting things about Bharati is the way he saw the freedom struggle occurring at multiple levels. And one of those levels was in terms of the psychological or mental freedom within the individual. And I think that that was an incredible insight on his part, because for him, the colonialism was not only the imposition of institutions on India, but it was the mentality, the feeling of dispossession and inferiority that it creates within the mind of the individual. And in fact, in that sense, all of his poetry, everything that he wrote, I think, was on a mission to give individuals a sense of self-esteem and dignity at a time when they were really downtrodden because of the British presence, the form that it took on Indian soil. So we can find a lot of his writings, in short, in answer to your question, where he talks in very, very personal terms about how to approach dealing with oneself, one's attitude to life, finding courage, and so on. Even in what he writes in English, it's so fascinating that he wrote a journal in English, which is kind of he's written it in many forms at once. It's almost a combination or a pastiche of poetry as well as prose, his journal of thoughts, where he actually describes in detail his own undertakings to try to purify himself psychologically and to develop these positive values, the fire of his good character within himself. So by reading a work like that, it's very moving, first of all, that a person of such stature went through such hard work on himself. But secondly, he's done something very generous because he's charted a path that any reader can also follow, going through a lot of the same methodologies that he describes and so on. And I would be negligent if I didn't mention that, when he went to Benares, one of the important things he acquired there was his knowledge of Sanskrit. In fact, he's written a beautiful poem on Sanskrit, Bulaha Kumari as well. But he had a love for Sanskrit, and he then got involved in studying Sanskrit literature, the Vedas and so on, with Sri Aurobindo in the time that they spent together in Pondicherry. That was essentially the core of their friendship, is they would read this Vedic literature together. And I understand that I'm not a Sanskrit scholar myself, but from reading him, I understand that the form of Sanskrit that is taken in those texts is very particular and requires a very deep study in order to understand the meaning. So he undertook all of that. And that influenced his development enormously. Also, Patanjali Yoga Sutra was a work that he had studied extensively. He had translated Bhagavad Gita. So he had a real solid foundation in Sanskrit literature, religious and philosophical literature at the time. But what he did, being a poet of such stature and a Renaissance thinker, is he brought those works and that knowledge into everything that he wrote in any language, I would say, Tamil, Sanskrit, or English. And so we can have that window of opportunity onto seeing what he knew and essentially being able to acquire that knowledge through him whenever we read his writing, including the English works that are in this book.
Sure. And I think I would like to also mention to everyone who may know, may not know, but just after the tragedy of Bhopal gas that happened way back in 1980s, many of the Protestants actually used some of the verses by Subramania Bharati. Now imagine, actually it happened almost 60 years after Bharati's death. And also very recently in one of the addresses, our Honorable Prime Minister actually recited the entire poem, and which is a great honor to not only to the language, but to the thoughts of the poet, and which represents, and there's a beautiful chapter in your book as well, which is about languages as the media of instruction, the national languages as the media of instruction. I would quickly like you to tell something about how can language and the culmination of the great thoughts can lead to something very good for the nation, as well as, while we talk about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, not only for us as a country, but for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to face a difficult reality, I think, that English has achieved a global dominance. And it's, I guess it's something that has both positive and negative aspects from an Indian point of view. Very often people say that the current prosperity and success enjoyed by India on the world stage is because, among other things, there is a presence of English that allows the country to function in a very advanced way. And I don't think we would be doing ourselves any favors by denying the power of English. But as I said, for Bharati, cultural diversity was very important. And the Tamil language was very important, but he saw other languages as being important in their own right as well. So I think that what he would like to see is exactly this process, that although we may be living in an English-dominated environment, we start to have an awareness of the importance of our tradition and go back and explore and learn whatever we can about it. So all I can say is it's a very difficult situation. We have to acknowledge the state of the world that we live in, but I think it's equally true that if we don't take some action, the end result is not going to be good. And I don't think any language in the world can actually stand its ground against the onslaught of English in that sense. By the way, I don't necessarily think the English language is benefiting from its own widespread dissemination either. I mean, that's another discussion. But we have to take some responsibility and try to do what we can to the extent that we can learn languages or get exposure to the literatures, to the ways of thinking through translation. Do the best we can to take an interest. Every word that we learn. I sometimes think to myself, because my mother tongue is not Tamil, except in the sense that my mother spoke Tamil. I was born in an English-speaking country, but I studied Tamil. I spoke Tamil with my parents, with my mother in particular. And I always think to myself, I know the Tamil word amma, and I can therefore identify myself as a Tamilian. That word means mother. So amma, also they would refer to the nation as Mada Parashakti and Bharat Mata, the mother. So I think we have to do what we can, even if it means learning one word, if it means reading and translation, if it means teaching,
yes,
encouraging people that we meet to learn the languages. But action must be taken if we want to preserve the cultural diversity, the richness of India's cultural diversity, which I think is unparalleled. It must be taken.
True. That's definitely very true. And I guess I will again take the liberty of representing Central Secretariat Library as well as the Ministry of Culture, which is actually doing a lot of such initiatives to make this happen, to bring this diversity through this unity through diversity. But I would also like to convey my personal thanks to Shri Parthasarathy ji, who couldn't join because of some meeting that's happening around, who's the Additional Secretary, Ministry of Culture, Shri Manoj Dehuri ji. Because of some personal reason, Manoj ji also could not join. But we have the privilege of having Shri Mr. Y. Rami ji and the entire team of CSL and CBL. I would also yet again give a mention to Mr. V. Ranganathan, former IPS, representing the Tamil Sangam, and everyone who could tune in today. But I would now request Sri M.C. Besji, who is the Library Information Officer at the Central Secretariat Library, to convey his vote of thanks. And post that, I may be able to recite of the poem that we were just talking. Maheshji, please.
On behalf of Central Secretariat Library and City Book Leader, we are thankful to our today's guest, Professor Mira T. Sundara Rajan ji, a noted author and the granddaughter of great Tamil Mahakavi Sri C. Subramania Bharati ji, known as one of the builders of the modern India and early nationalist thinker from South India. There is no doubt that she has described the interesting pen pictures about Sri Subramania Bharati ji in details. As all of you are aware that our country is celebrating Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, our today's joint program with City Book Leader is also a part of the SAD series. I am very thankful to our Additional Secretary Sri Parthasarathy Sen Sharma ji and our Director Sri Manoj Dehuri ji for providing their valuable guidance and motivations time to time. I also endorse the cooperation of Sri Mohit Gupta ji, City Book Leader, and the cooperation of my staff under the leadership of mainly Dr. Y. A. Rao, LIO, Sri Rakesh Goswami ji, Sri Munish Sen ji, Sri Neeraj Kumar ji, Sri Ajay Bhaskar ji, all are ALIO, and Sri Dev Kumar and Sri Ankit Risarya ji, library professional. I am also thankful to our members, readers who have participated in the today's program. Thanks to everybody again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maheshji. And we're getting some very beautiful comments, Professor Mira. I would now open the chat to everyone so that they can send direct messages to each and everyone. That is one we just received a message from Jaffna. There's a student who has mentioned about multiple verses, and believe me, in these 60 minutes, like an old T series cassette or a TDK cassette, we have limitations of the time with us at 60 minutes. But we would love to have a complete set of our lives dedicated to Bharati. And I think what Bharati has given me in the last couple of months when I've been reading about him, especially is that feeling of no fear. And with this pandemic going on, with so much happening around businesses, we are all always in a format of anxiety. And I think that's where one of my very close friends and mentors, he's a CEO of a very large oil and gas company. And when I said that, sir, I'm reading about Bharati, he's like a book friend to me. He actually said in our school days, whenever we used to fear exams, we only used to recite this poem. I am not able to recite it in the Tamil, but somehow I got a beautiful translation of it by a very noted North Indian poet who was based out of Bareilly, and he has translated it into Hindi. And possibly while we were talking about the translation and the quality of translation, I can still sense and say that it's about the expressions that the words bring to us and the feelings that are hidden in that poem. The translation actually goes like this, and Professor Mira, if you would like to add to it, you can add the Tamil version of it, but I will quickly say a few lines of this poem, which is Nirbhay, 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 चाहे पूरी दुनिया हमारे विरुद्ध हो जाए, निर्भय निर्भय निर्भय, चाहे हमें अपशब्द कहे कोई, चाहे हमें ठुकराए, निर्भय निर्भय निर्भय, चाहे हमसे छीन ली जाए जीवन की सुविधाएं, which is very relevant to pandemic, चाहे हमसे छीन ली जाए जीवन की सुविधाएं, निर्भय निर्भय निर्भय, चाहे हमें संगी साथी ही विष देने लग जाए, निर्भय निर्भय निर्भय, चाहे सर पर आसमान ही क्यों ना फटने लग जाए, Nirbhay, Nirbhay, Nirbhay. That's the Hindi translation of the poem that Professor Mira was mentioning a while ago. And Professor Mira, if you would like to add to the Tamil part of it, we would be happy to listen to that as your closing remarks.
Well, I think the essence of it was what I quoted before, which you can also match to the translation, which is simply Achamillai, Achamillai, Achamillai. And I don't speak Hindi myself. I'm so embarrassed to say my father was a great Hindi scholar and actually got a prize for Hindi debating from Nehru himself. Who said that he could not believe that a South Indian could learn Hindi to such a level. And so here I am, and I have not yet learned Hindi, but I could feel how beautiful the translation must be from the way in which you recited it. And I thank you very much for that. It's a beautiful thing to see translation between the Indian languages.
I will take the liberty here, Professor Mira, to formally introduce you to V. Ranganathanji from Tamil Sangam. I've opened his mic as well, and he recited the poem to me a day ago. Sir, why don't you give us the pleasure of closing this session with the recitation of the poem, please? By the way, Mr. Ranganathan is a former IPS. He was part of the Delhi police, a very senior cop, and you can see his other side as a literature lover and as a culture lover. Mr. Ranganathan.
First of all, vanakkam. I am very much delighted to hear the lecture of Ms. Mira Rajan. Actually, again and again, one question is being asked by our youngsters, whether poems of Bharati is relevant today also. So the answer is by expressing his dreams, he has set goals for us. So it is still relevant, and even though we have achieved to some extent in the field of emancipation of women and then other activities also, but still we have a long way to go. So Delhi Tamil Sangam is always doing a lot of work in propagating the Bharati's dreams as well as the goals he is set for. So I conclude my just participation with அச்சமில்லை அச்சமில்லை அச்சமென்பது இல்லையே உச்சி மீது வாடியிருந்து வீழுகின்ற போனிலும் அச்சமில்லை அச்சமில்லை அச்சமென்பது இல்லையே. Thank you.
No fear, no fear. And thank you, Professor Mira, for bringing Bharati yet again to us in a new form. And I would recommend this book. Before it also reaches you, to everyone to have this book. There's a list of other books as well. Usha Rajgopalan's the translation she has done, remarkable work that she has done. M. Rajaram's book, which is I Sing the Glory of This Land. And also, if you wish to take this story to children, Amar Chitra Katha has done a beautiful illustrative book on Bharati. And but if you are slightly more aware, this book and Dr. Vijaya Bharati's books will take you deep into the life of Bharati. I would recommend this book to everyone. And with this, we are very, very thankful, Professor Rajan, that you could join in, and that too so late in your time zone. Thanks a lot for all the efforts, and on behalf of CBL, City Book Leaders, as well as Central Secretariat Library, we would like to convey our word of thanks to you and many, many gratitude, Professor Rajan.
Thank you very much.